Thank you very much, Jane. What a kind introduction. Huh? Don't get one of those every day. I would say, of course, it depends. You know, what you describe does rather depend on what you're seeing in the mirror in the first place. So it's not always perhaps as positive as it was with Jane and colleagues. Thank you very much for being here today. Let's go straight into. I think Jane's touched on some of these. Why has ALNAP? I mean, ALNAP's been looking at operational leadership now for 5 years probably, and I think the reason is not lost on any of us. As Jane suggested, leadership, particularly the sort of field leadership, the leadership of responses, which is what this report is about, is regularly cited in evaluations and in the literature as a key constraint to good performance, to effectiveness in humanitarian response. And as a result, of course, many ALNAP members, many of the organisations represented here today, and many donors, many operational organisations have put quite a lot of time, thought, money into approaches to improving operational leadership. And as a result, the ALNAP network wanted to kind of look more deeply into the question of what works. And so that's what's led to the current report. What's rather interesting, though, is that while the problems of leadership are mentioned fairly often in the literature, what leadership is, the definitional piece, is often not there. Leadership is not always defined. And so, in a rather dull way, I think I probably need to start by explaining what we meant by leadership for this report. And because it wasn't defined, we used the definition from a previous piece of ALNAP work, Leadership in Action, which some of you might have seen, which said that basic leadership is a combination, operational leadership in humanitarian response, because that is all we can talk about today. We're not saying that this report deals with other kinds of leadership in other situations. But operational leadership in humanitarian response really is about doing three things. It's about identifying what a good endpoint for the response looks like. You know, it's sometimes called the vision, but where are we going with this? It's about identifying how often scarce resources are going to be organized in such a way as to achieve that endpoint, or the strategy part, how do we prioritize, how do we do what we do? And then it's about the implementation of that strategy, including making decisions about changing it as you go along, because of course humanitarian operations tend not to work 1, 2, 3, 4 much as one might like them to. So this is the definition that we used, and certainly when we went back and looked at the documents, the evaluations, the other sort of policy documents about leadership, where they were saying that leadership wasn't working, generally it was one or a combination of these three things that were being talked about. So these seem to be broadly where the problem occurred. Now, what was really interesting, I think, and if you like, perhaps the launch point for this particular piece of work, was the literature didn't only suggest that these three things were what leadership was, but also very, very often, fairly consistently, the literature suggested that these three things were being done by an individual person. And so implicit in the definition of leadership was not just it was the doing of these three things, but it was the doing of these three things by a leader. Yeah. And I think that's very important, because from there flows a lot of, if we think that that's what leadership is, it is an individual doing these three things. The failure of leadership then becomes the failure, by extension, is the failure of that individual to do these things correctly. And our attempts to prevent leadership failing then become about skilling individuals, getting the right individuals, getting that right person in place. And if there's one thing, one sort of central idea which I'd hope that we discuss around this and around the sort of the research that we did here, it is actually to go back to that often implicit assumption and say, is that what leadership is? Yeah? Do those three functions, are those three functions in a humanitarian response best achieved by having a highly skilled individual doing them? And what we saw was that when we looked at other emergency response services, particularly civil defence, the answer was no. Yeah? Civil defence organisations in general were not relying exclusively on one person to do the leadership. And when we looked at the evaluations of successful programmes, as opposed to unsuccessful programmes, the answer was also no. The visioning, the strategy, and the implementation were not just being done by an individual. They were being done by a mixture of the individual, the team of people around the individual, and a set of structures, procedures, and processes which defined certain ways of operating, certain ways of getting things done. And so leadership, that is, if you were to ask the question, how do you achieve a vision, have a strategy for the vision, and implement that strategy, all three of these elements appeared to be, from the literature and from parallel literature in other sectors which also deal with emergency response, all three of these things seem to be important. So we said, well, that's really interesting. Why don't we actually try and test that a bit more? You know, that's kind of coming out of the literature review. And the literature review, which is available, please take some away. It's called Who's in Charge Here? Why don't we try and test that a little bit further? So what we did was we sent out a questionnaire to 34 country offices, to the leadership team in each of those country offices, normally about 6 or 7 people. And they were country offices of UN agencies, NGOs, Red Cross and Red Crescent, and national NGOs. So we tried to get a sort of fairly, not representative, but a sample that reflected the diversity of humanitarian organisations. And we sent this questionnaire out, and we asked people in the questionnaire to do two things. First of all, to say how good they thought their office was at defining the endpoint, defining the vision for humanitarian response, how good it was at creating a strategy, how good it was at implementing the strategy. And we then asked them, to what degree do you have these, the following in place in your office? A leader with good leadership skills was one of the things we asked, but we also asked about other things: information management processes, standard operating procedures, delegations of authority. So we looked at all three of these areas: the individual, the team, and the processes, structures and procedures. And we then correlated those where we had better, did a statistical correlation, where we had better responses in terms of effectiveness. What were the things that correlated most strongly with that? And what were the things that correlated most strongly with not having very good self-reported effectiveness? I hope that's clear. I hope so. Okay, I'm seeing some nodding heads, so I'll assume it is. And what did we find? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. But first of all, I just wanted, because we thought this was interesting, I think you'll think it's interesting too. Before going on to what we found about the correlations, there's some descriptive statistics that came from these 34 country offices. We thought we wanted to say, you know, who are the people who are making these decisions, creating the vision? Who are the leaders and the leadership teams? And it's quite interesting to see the gender breakdown was 40-60, female, male, of people at the of members of the leadership teams. And it was exactly the same for the person in the senior leadership position, for the country director. Yeah? So it was 40-60, not parity, but better perhaps than some previous research has suggested across this sample. In terms of we did ask people to say what their regional background, so not their nationality because the list would have been too long, but the region that they came from. In terms of the teams, it was again about 60-40 between people from, broadly speaking, the global south and people from the global north. 59% were from the global south and 40% from the global north for the team members. But for the leaders, the country directors, only 32% of country directors or country level leaders were from the global south. So unlike the gender, there seemed to be a difference between, in terms of cultural or national background, between those people who were in the leadership team and the people who'd made it to the leadership position. Another thing that we asked was, we averaged how effective the leadership teams thought their responses were. And on a 6-point scale, it was 4.3. Yeah? So 4.3 out of 6, which obviously it's the leadership team saying that. You might get different responses from other stakeholders, particularly from the people affected by disasters. You might. But this does suggest, I think, to us that some of the sort of discourse about a broken humanitarian system, about things really not working in all cases, there is another story there as well. Anyhow, back to the chase. 4 of the things that correlated most effectively, correlated most strongly with leadership effectiveness were team decision making, the degree to which the leadership team were involved in making decisions, structures, and the degree to which the structure had consciously been adapted for emergency response, procedures, simple operating procedures, and information management systems. The 5th one was the skills of the individual leader. So the skills of the individual in charge are obviously important, but it's not the whole story. These things are important too. With respect to team decision making, leadership was more effective where, that is, those 3 functions were done more effectively where there was a high level of involvement from the leadership team and sometimes the broader organisation in making decisions. In some cases, the nature of that involvement was that the leadership team was making recommendations to the leader. In some cases, the nature of that involvement was that it was a consensus decision-making, so that, in fact, everybody was making the decision and the leader was sort of primus inter pares in that group. In many cases, it was kind of somewhere between the two, actually, was the model that seemed to be the most common in the effective country offices. It was a situation where the team were making recommendations, and in most cases the leader was accepting them. So it was kind of consultation that ended up looking a lot like consensus. Although in all cases it was understood both by the leader and by the leadership team that the buck stopped and the final accountability was with that individual. But the teams were working well enough that that individual very seldom had to actually step in and make that happen. One point, because consensus is a dirty word in many humanitarian fora. By consensus here, what we meant was not everybody loving it. Yeah? It was the degree to which everyone was prepared to go along with that decision. And I think that's a very important distinction. In terms of structure, really there were 3 things going on here. The first was that the effective offices had thought about it. They'd actually thought, what's the best way we can use the resources and structure the office for the kind of response that we're engaged in? And they'd done a couple of things. Firstly, they delegated decision-making authority. Generally, there were those decisions which fairly clearly pertained to the leader and the leadership team. They were office-wide decisions. They were often political, sometimes about funding. And then there were decisions which really didn't have to go that high up, that needed to be made much closer to implementation. And so offices had identified which sorts of decisions could and could not be delegated, and they then delegated as much as possible the ones that didn't have to be done at the centre. Also, very clear clarity between the different elements of the organisation to ensure that there was very little overlap. And this is not, I think, a surprise to anyone here. There was very little overlap and also very few gaps. But what this meant was that as the situation changed, they were prepared to change their structure, make certain parts of it bigger, decrease other parts of it. And that's often quite difficult because individuals had to then be moved and lose power within the organisation. So you had sort of step-aside mechanisms and so on that were working. And the third thing that they'd done was, having split the organisation up, they had established internal communication systems to keep information flowing between these different bits. And there were a variety of different ways that had been done. The procedures piece was really interesting because there was a really strong correlation between the degree to which leadership was effective and the degree to which there were standard operating procedures. But when we did the interviews and asked about procedures, it was kind of a 50-50 split. So although if you like, the statistics were saying one thing, the individuals were saying things. Some of them said, yeah, no, this is great. Some of them said that proceduralization is the worst thing that could conceivably happen to this office. Yeah? And the interesting piece about that was that the ones who were saying that were always talking about procedures that had been imposed by headquarters and came in telephone directory-sized documents. Yeah? And the ones who were saying the procedures the best thing that could happen to us were always the ones who were talking about procedures that had been generated within the office based on the existing best practices of that office and which could be put on one piece of paper. And so when you talk to the interviewees who were saying, no, procedures are terrible, and you said, well, okay, I get that. So how do you all know what you're doing? They would give you a set of procedures verbally in the interview, which had been created and were implicit within the office, but were not written down. So these procedures existed in all the effective offices, but often they weren't written down. And the reason that these procedures supported effective leadership seemed to be, firstly, it meant that the leader and the leadership team did not have to sweat a lot of decisions. A lot of decisions had been proceduralized. And so 70% of the stuff just happened without individuals having to put very precious time and energy into doing it. Secondly, because it meant that the individual who was accountable and the leadership team could allow people close to the action to get on and do the work, knowing that they were doing it according to best practice. Yeah. And so it simultaneously allowed the leadership team to heave a sigh of relief and people to get on with the job on the ground. But it was difficult to get right. Finally, information management. A lot of information is collected in many responses. What appeared to matter was not the collection, although collection is important. It was seeing information as part of a decision-making system. And that meant putting as much emphasis on, are we collecting information which is required for decisions right now, on information selection, on how do we disseminate the information? Is it going to the right people? Is the right information going to the right people? Particularly on who holds the big picture. You know, who in this office is meant to know, have that strategic overview of what's going on. If everyone's doing it, we're probably wasting time, but somebody's got to be doing it. And if that somebody goes, how is that being handed over? And finally, regularly updating. There is, and I know that we and many others have said this before, but there is still a tendency in information collection maybe to focus more on the product, the assessment in particular, than on the updating and continually getting new information over the course of the response. And effective officers were doing that. So there was a very strong correlation between information management and effective leadership. And when we looked at what that meant, these were the things that came out. And overall, some sort of across all of these areas, the importance of country offices doing this work for themselves. There was a lot that could be done from headquarters in terms of identifying what needed to be done, templates, guidance, but it didn't replace country offices sitting down and working out their local information management system. The importance of being flexible, as I think we'll probably touch on, all of these things are fairly highly structured, and you also, to make them work, you also have to know when you've kind of gone off the rails and when you're not going to use the procedures anymore, when you are in a new situation to which these procedures don't apply. And finally, the importance of building on what worked. And I'd just like to, if I may, finish by saying it was remarkable to see how much was working. It was humbling, actually, to talk to colleagues and the people in the field who were actually doing all this stuff already. You know, none of this actually came as a surprise. There did seem to be a fairly significant difference between the policy discourse and the evaluative discourse on the one hand, where things were broken and not working, and the reality of what was going on in the field. So I think that's probably something that's worth bearing in mind, and thank you very much.